You want to make sure that you're not oversupplying things or even undersupplying. So if you go back to, like intro to soils, probably maybe in some cases, intro to general chemistry, but Justus von Liebig, way back in the day, he had his concept of the law of the minimum. So the lowest amount of the thing is going to impact the yield overall. So you have to make sure that everything's being met across the board. If you're limiting on one thing, a micronutrient of some kind, if the pH is off, you could be limiting your overall production or quality. So having that information is really critical. And these aren't expensive tests. It's like $20 and some change for a general fertility test. So you get a lot of information for a little bit of money, and you can do composite sampling for a whole area. So you don't have to spend a whole lot just to get that information, but it will make a huge difference in terms of like how you manage your soil, for whatever you're working on.
Hey guys, Al here. As I mentioned before, we wanted to at Vitalize Seed do more webinar type videos, educational videos this year. We were fortunate to do one with an animal scientist, Rebecca from Ward Labs. And now we're with somebody who I've been pestering for years before I think Vitalize Seed even started. A friend of mine, somebody I really look up to. It's Dr. Patrick Freeze, and we're going to talk all things soil today. So Dr. Patrick, welcome.
Yep, thanks, Albert. Yeah, this is good.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, real quickly, for those who might not know you, what's your role at Ward and kind of your background in soil science?
Oh, yeah. So I've been with Ward. It'll be 4 years in December. I started out as their R&D scientist, soil health scientist, and then I moved into their director of research and development, sort of overseeing soil testing, everything soil chemistry, method development, testing, customer support, a lot of outreach, educational pieces, things like that. I took a little break, came out to the Western US, and then I came back to Ward as their Western research outreach lead and lead scientist. So I do a lot of the same things. It's just kind of focused on, I guess a lot of it's focused on a lot of research. So people that are doing like startups, applied, any sort of applied research that they need support on, along with the testing, but advisement on, the setup, trials, results, interpretation, things like that. A lot of it's Western U.S., specialty markets, orchards. A lot of the stuff that I've worked on quite a bit, it being from Washington State, where I did my PhD. But I did my undergraduate here in Reno, and so I was very used to the Western U.S., so it's kind of nice to get back out here. But again, I'm still doing very much the same things with Ward, a lot of customer support, data interpretation, answering questions, a lot of, speaking engagements and public facing, things like this. So, which is great. I think it's really great to be included, on these opportunities to provide information, answer questions, and just kind of get the message out there with soils.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so similar kind of in the sense of like you have such a eclectic background and different people you talk to. And, with Vitalize, when we started, a lot of it was food plots, deer hunters. That was really a big interest. I selfishly had interest in, I grow a big garden and we have a blueberry patch and even lawn care and lawn maintenance. Like I've always had interest in like, okay, I think these things are getting abused with the amount of fertility that's going down, or maybe not the understanding of the way in which fertility is being used, kind of blanket, these companies will just be, Albert's Lawn Care. They just go out there and it's like, we're putting down X number of units of N and that's just what we do. Right. And so I've always really had interest in these other things, but we started really focused around, habitat, wildlife. And it's been interesting to see how, now we work with a lot of flower farms, so now I find myself doing research into things like what is the best way to grow dahlias, or sunflowers, or specifically not for wildlife for sunflowers, but for, production, right, for cutting or pick your own. So it's been really interesting to kind of see how soil health and soil management and, preservation of soil organic matter really goes into other areas that you might not have never considered, from where you start at, So we've kind of had a similar journey, and even up to working with some row crop farmers now, and especially with drone technology. We had one gentleman this year who he's always really wanted to do diverse covers, but he's never felt like he could do it due to the inability to get it in before harvesting his beans. And he's like, I just don't think I can really get a tractor in there without ruining my bean. He was just had all these concerns. Well, now he has a friend who has one of these drones, and we made a custom mix that fit his need. He wants to graze it off after harvesting beans and do some neat things. And he's doing it all with drone technology, where he feels very confident being able to increase his diversity of covers after soybeans, and offer benefit to cattle, right? So he's going to graze it off probably around March before going back in with, I think, corn the following year, if I remember correctly. So all that to say, it's amazing how you can just find these different connections as you explained in your research and education. With all that being said, let's keep it, somewhat high level. I always can, I say it respectfully, nerd out and just send you these things that are off the wall and have these ideas, but let's keep it high level for the viewers and listeners. Why does soil testing matter? What's important about that?
Yeah, I think about this quite often because I always interact with a range of people from like you said, people that are doing different things, and depending on what system they're working in and sort of the goal that they're trying to achieve. But in some areas, people don't even do soil testing, so they just go by sight, which is totally fine. But you are sort of like shooting in the dark, I would say. So the best, the best thing you can do for yourself, I would say, in anything you do in your life, is to have the most information possible. And so for soil testing, because we're talking about dollars, so input costs, and then yields and profits and return on investment. You want to make sure that you're not oversupplying things or even undersupplying. So if you go back to like intro to soils. I think probably maybe in some cases intro to general chemistry, but Justice von Liebig, way back in the day, he had his concept of the law of the minimum. So the lowest amount of the thing is going to impact the yield overall. So you have to make sure that everything's being met across the board. If you're limiting on one thing, a micronutrient of some kind, if the pH is off, you could be limiting your overall production or quality. So having that information is really critical, and it's for one thing. It's not; these aren't expensive tests. It's like $20 and some change for a general fertility test. So you get a lot of information for a little bit of money, and you can do composite sampling for a whole area. So you don't have to spend a whole lot just to get that information, but it will make a huge difference in terms of like how you manage your soil. For whatever you're working on, turf. Like golf courses, gardens, row crops. Of course, like you said, in some cases, people just, add a bunch of N in some cases, and they just call it good. And for people who are yield focused, that's kind of their goal, is they'll put something on no matter what they see on the page, So, but for people making conscious choices in terms of how they're managing. And this also goes into conservation too. So you don't want to oversupply things, have runoff, erosion. So you're making the best choice you can overall for not just your yield and your ROI, but for the environment, going forward, because other people have to use these resources, indefinitely.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I've always thought of Liebig's law as I think if you Google it, it comes up this way as well. I've always tried to explain it to people if I'm talking on the phone or helping interpret a soil test, is like picture a bucket with a hole in the bottom. And if you can fill that hole, whether it's with zinc or maybe it is nitrogen, right? But whatever that lowest hole is, if we plug that, the bucket can be filled, right? But until then, we can't totally fill that bucket. And to your point too, I think it was John Kemp from Regenerative Agriculture, AEA, excuse me. I think he said, let's not forget the law of the maximum too, right? And that kind of goes to your point of just over applying and things like that. And I've always found that to be kind of an interesting concept, because there are, whether it's cover crop seeds or in the food plot space, or if you go to Lowe's or Home Depot and you buy grass, it'll say apply 250 pounds of triple 13 or triple 19, and I've always really had heartburn over that kind of generalized recommendation of a synthetic, particularly synthetic fertilizer, because we don't have any other data, right? And there could be other things, too much phosphorus would be tying up your zinc or whatever, right? There's all these ratios we should be mindful of too. So let's talk about that briefly. So there seems to be, this gap between you get this soil test. And I think when I do a lot of, I've kind of, as our business has grown, I look at a lot of these tests and give a lot of fertility. And people, I think, get a little frustrated with me because I get into the nuances of like, well, I want to ask them, how are you growing? Are you tilling? Are you, conservation tilling? And then how do you plan to apply the amendments? And as no-till has grown, there seems to be a lot of, oh, I'm just going to, broadcast, or maybe I have a no-till drill or a no-till planter, but I'm just going to broadcast synthetic fertilizer out, right? And oftentimes and correct me if I'm wrong, but from a lot of the research that I've seen and read, certain amendments will do very well that way, depending on rainfall and stuff. And others are really going to be kind of a hurt on your pocketbook or more of a generational play. Phosphorus is one, for example, specifically in synthetic form. I do want to emphasize that we're not talking about manure or something like that. So when you get these raw numbers, how important do you think it is to bridge that gap for the grower to really understand next steps and how to interpret those numbers?
Yeah, it's always, and I think that's probably one of the funnest parts of my job is sort of, if we get some results, someone does some soil testing, sometimes for the first time, and sort of taking them through the pieces of the data to kind of tell the story of their soil, because every soil is different, I don't know, I feel like I'm reading Lord of the Rings, if for as a soil scientist, when you go through these reports, because there's just all these different pieces to it, and you'll see these, numbers that are really high or really low. And then I think, why, what's going on? How is that going to affect this over here? I would say, you're going through like a soil report for the first time, and broadly, you look at the big pieces, the big players, so like pH, organic matter, some of those things, and from there, you can kind of like, and this is really, looking at, I would say, looking at people who are on the cusp of adopting sort of regenerative practices. They're going from like conventional to more regenerative management styles. And so changing the mindset from a concentration, kind of mindset from like conventional ag, it's all about numbers, A minus B equals C. And more of the regenerative system, you're looking at more of like function, function and interplay. And so it's really different. And that's why it's so exciting. And I think why a lot of people are much smarter today about agriculture, because having to understand these things, you really have to understand the ecology of the soil, because it's more like ecology management, not a concentrations game. So that's really what I start to do is I say, okay, now look at, your organic matter. It's really low. That's because of years of tillage. And, so having to start from those big pieces, like the pH is super high or the pH is super low, just from like excessive nitrogen application. Having to start from those big pieces, manage those, and then we get into, okay, now there's a hospitable range that bacteria and fungal communities can sort of prosper in. Now we can sort of start to promote their behavior and activity by adding these other things, which could in turn affect this. But, so it's trying to like the whole like, what do you call it, like a Ruberg's, the whole like mechanism of what's going on. Having to show them, if you do this, this is going to happen, but not in a scary way, because soil science can be very, very rabbit hole-ish. You can go down these really deep rabbit holes and get confronted with so much information. You like wash your hands of it. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go back to what I was doing. That was a lot easier to understand. So that's really it, is just showing people that it's not that difficult if you know the big controlling factors, like they say, pH is the master variable. Having to address those large things, and then you can get into understanding and working with these smaller players to kind of get the system as a whole up and running.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So that obviously to plug Ward for a second, but that's what I love about your guys' tests is like the standard S4 conventional, which is one we sell on our website. And I tell people you can get it from us, you can get it from Ward. It's like the same deal. But the reason I push it so much and I have it on our website is because it gives people everything that you at least need to get started. And we do the soil health assessment. And I tell people, I'm like, if you're like me and you really want to monitor something year over year and look at biology, or you even like I did some PLFA with you all last year, the year before, I think it was, that's fantastic. But at least to get a starting point, getting that Ward test, because I get so many people will send me, hey, I did a test with, and there's a lot of good labs, but they'll send me these other labs that, not saying that they're bad, but oh, I paid $4 for this. And I'm like, there's nothing here, right? Like there's nothing here. And sometimes I'd love to see your kind of take on this. So we're talking about, pH, organic matter, CEC, base saturations. I like having the micros and macros, at least, if not in pounds, at least in ppm values, so we can kind of understand like where are we relative to the soil type. But I think sometimes when I'm talking to people, they'll be surprised when they're like, oh, look how great my pH and organic matter are. And I'll say, okay, that's good. But you're telling me that you're feeling like there's a lot of compaction, right? Yeah, yeah. And have you done a lot of tills? And we'll go through this whole, nuance. And they really will say, I have a light soil, a low CEC soil. For those who aren't familiar with CEC, it's like, say, sandy, or just for simplicity. But what I'll find is that they have driven up their magnesium so high in the soil from just putting on, maybe not measuring, or maybe just putting on as much dolomite lime as they could, that they'll say, oh, my soil's really heavy. And I'm looking at all the numbers and I'm like, your soil's not actually heavy. It's a lighter soil, but you've driven up magnesium. So yes, your pH is good, but we're not out of the woods here from the chemical side of the soil. We could use maybe something like gypsum. Let's get this a little bit more balanced, and then biology will really be able to flourish. Do you think that that's a good way to kind of look at? I like to look at the physical, chemical, and then of course the biological side. We can really go down a rabbit hole, but to just at a high level to get that foundation built.
Yeah, I think it's exactly a good approach to understanding, what you're starting with. So, and I do the same thing whenever going back to what you originally said, when people are first starting out, and I say, they're trying to get into the more of the soil health realm, I say, well, just start with a standard fertility test. Just see where you're starting, because you get a lot of information really quick. From there, you can make your decisions. But yeah, exactly. From there, you can see how things are balanced or not balanced, And so, and there's different schools of thought on this. I think it's really interesting because they teach us this in soils, looking at the cation exchange capacity, the base saturation, what's on the surface of the clay. And if you step back from that, really it's telling you the sort of the harmony of the system. So if you have a lot of hydrogens or acidity on there and low calcium, that just tells you you're working in an acidic system. And if you balance out the calcium, then you're, by applying lime or something like that, then you're going to drive the pH back up to something in more of a normal range. So it's really kind of this scale of some kind. It gives you a really good approximation in terms of like how balanced the system is. Some people don't approach those things, maybe because they don't really fully understand how to use that for their management on the ground. But I think it really just depends on, again, like how much information you want, how comfortable you are dissecting some of this stuff. But if you work with a soil scientist, if you go like you get soil testing done at Ward and then you come back to, what do these results mean? We'll walk through all the results and answer all the questions, but kind of giving you the understanding about how to look at these things, like your potassium is super low or it's super high, what's going on here? It could be parent material. It could be like a mica rich soil. So it's higher in potassium, although a lot of it's not available, but, in the soil, it's there. So just trying to understand those broader things and how to balance out the system and what that even really means. So it's always context dependent. So like you said, you had blueberries, that system's totally different than corn, because blueberries need a very acidic environment, which is amazing. But, I've seen blueberry results from, being in Washington State. I look at these soils and they're like pH 4 to 5. And I'm like, what are you working with? I'm like, oh, these are blueberries. It's like, okay, well, then might be actually pretty good then. So understanding the context and how to apply that data to that context, because in that system, for example, you talk about like balancing the base saturation. That's much harder to do in that system. It might not even be the objective. It's just in that system, your understanding of balance is going to be a little bit different based on that specific system.
Yeah, and so that's a really interesting one, because I think I remember when you and I first started talking. I've said this before to people who followed it. I have around 70 blueberry bushes behind mom and dad's house. And, I pulled soil tests and it's like perfect range for blueberries. So there's nothing I'm overly concerned with. Of course, certain things in that lower pH range is not going to be as available. Example, nitrogen, right? So one of the things that we've done is, well, it's relatively inexpensive to foliar apply nitrogen during the growing season for those blueberries. And I remember asking, I go, what if somebody's growing blueberries and it's in a alkaline soil? Like it's very expensive or hard to reduce a 7.8, say, to 4.5. And you were like, well, they probably apply chelated iron and those lower things that aren't available. So I think that's another important thing for people to understand. If you're trying to grow cover crop for deer or for a farming application in low CEC soils, the way in which you apply nutrients or handle nutrients might just be different than somebody who's in Iowa, who has just really dark, rich soils, and their soil can hold a lot of different things, and they maybe could handle more tillage or whatnot, and they can get away with it. And I think that's a really important thing for people to understand. I often tell this story, Pat. I think you'll enjoy this. I have a friend who's been a mentor to me, and he's an agronomist, and he handles like 20 or 30,000 row crop acres in the Southeast. And some of the ground in which they were growing corn on, I'm like, you would think you'd be getting your beach towel out. I mean, it was just so light. And I'm like, how are you doing this? Because this corn looks like it would rival Midwestern corn. I was so interested. And one thing in the Southeast, they do use a lot of pivot systems. It's relatively common in some of those areas, but it was heavily relying on timing of nutrient applications and ensuring that the nutrients that they were using, be it a foliar or something like that, or a Y drop, were at the right time. So they're not just going out and throwing triple 13 out at planting and saying, okay, we're good for this corn yield, or because it wouldn't work in that soil type. So that all goes back to, in my opinion, and I'd love to hear your comment on it, that importance of getting that foundation of a soil test so we can understand how and where to apply those nutrients.
Yeah, and that's what I tell a lot of people too, is that, you're not applying everything at once. A lot of these things have to be spoon-fed in because that's just like any organism, they're not going to eat their year's worth of food in one sitting, So, and plants are the same way, microbes are the same way, humans are. So knowing the timing, and it goes back to that context. So, what system are you working with? Can it be, or do you have to use foliar or broadcast? What's your soil texture like? What's your organic matter like? CEC or cation exchange capacity, what does that look like? So kind of understanding how to manage that based on the data. And for an example, I worked with some, I guess, vineyard growers in Western Colorado. And those are very high pH soils, very calcium rich, which is great for vineyards, but it's awful for micronutrient management because the pH is so high, the plants struggle to pull stuff out. So they do everything foliar. And it's insane there because, especially for iron, so they said the bedrock chemistry is so different, meter by meter, that you can spray one plant one time, the next plant 8 times, so it's all about how, it's how you understand the nuances of these things, your skill level, and your eyes are the best judgment. And I also tell people that too. So, in a lot of these regenerative systems, for example, I saw one which was just a native pasture with a nice diverse mix that he had in there. The soil test showed super low potassium. It was just like I would say deficiency level low. We went out there and visited the site, and there were 0 deficiency symptoms. It looked like lush and green. From that, I understood that because you had that diverse mix in that context, the plants were able to work together to pull things out of the soil, even though a soil test might not show that. So you have to understand the context, what you're seeing in the field. So you really getting in there with the data, and then also with your eyes to see, what you're actually seeing, to kind of tell the story of what's going on and how to affect your management on the ground.
Well, and I think so you just hit on something that I love to talk about, because I always tell people, for context, I'll have like a food plot. I go, look how great I did. And we kind of have the benefit of doing those things, is like we can use our eyes, but not to pass that judgment to the guy who's a row crop farmer, because they can't necessarily take a whole risk of a season to say like, well, let's just see if we're going to pull up potassium, right? Like they don't have that ability. Regardless of, there was a gentleman, he did a talk. I don't know if you're familiar, Dr. Rick Mulvaney. He had research out of, is it Illinois University, something like that, and about, I think it was called the potassium paradox. I might be getting that mixed up with something else, but essentially showing how we could pull a lot more potassium out of the clay, substrate of the soil than is going to ever show on really almost any test, right? I don't know if he looked at total nutrient digest, but I'm really truncating a ton of work that this gentleman did, so I apologize. But the point being is, then I remember sitting through this webinar, or reading comments. I forget exactly how I digested the information. People were like, My farm would go bankrupt, and I think that's kind of the beauty of all of this is finding like where it meshes. But for a lot of our listeners and viewers, like I have an example of an area where I've sent many samples and it's like a 15 CEC soil, and the phosphorus comes back every year on a 6-inch probe at like 18 ppm. But I had a 17-way, our spring summer mix, we call it Nitro Boost. There's a lot of legumes, but there's also Sudan and sorghum, and we had good rainfall this spring, so that certainly helped. I mean, it was 14 to 15 foot tall in some cases. I mean, planting through it was like a little bit scary because you could almost not see it. And that's on a 75 horsepower tractor with a bucket to push things down to get through it, right? But clearly there were no symptoms. I mean, it was as green as it could possibly be. Sunflowers, at least where the deer couldn't get to them, were 6, 7 foot tall. I mean, lush, huge sunflower head. So clearly a very thriving system. Even with that, if I went in there and said, okay, Patrick, we're going to plant row crop corn and we're going to try to get 200 bushel per acre, I'd probably have to be looking at fertility management still, and how am I going to apply it in the furrow and do those things. So I like to try to bridge that for folks, because sometimes I do think, as I'm sure you see a lot more than I do, there's this like animosity between, kind of a conventional and the regenerative. And it's like, hey, we can all agree that there's nuance to these different programs.
Yeah, I mean that's a big question I get is how are you gonna on this path are you going to get to like a zero input kind of setup? It's like, well, you have to understand what your goals are. If it's yield driven or is it per acre profit driven? These are two different mindsets. One's conventional and one's kind of like a new way of looking at things. So if you're moving to more regenerative system, getting away from the concentration sort of ideology. So yeah, you'll see like in your example, you'll see some phosphorus in there, but you'll see like these massive yields, and you can't overlay that onto like a row crop because you can in some regards if you understand more of the pieces of the system. So like say, for example, if you're doing cover crops in a row crop system, well, what's the nutrient composition of that cover crop? Because that's going to be like, you're growing fertilizer basically. So kind of taking some of that, going that into your calculations, because that's going to be broken down with time, but then also understanding that breakdown rate. So it's all about mineralization rates too. So you have to understand all these different pieces, and it's not complicated. But again, it's more of a function ecology kind of understanding of what's going on. You're not looking at concentrations. You have to kind of understand how everything kind of plays together. And also, along with the composition of the cover crop, the carbon composition versus the nitrogen composition. If it's too grassy or too high in carbon, like a grass species, it's going to take forever to break down. Sometimes people have to apply nitrogen just to get the stuff to break down. So you have to understand, you have to have the right mix of these things in your cover crops to have that breakdown, the right CN ratio, carbon to nitrogen ratio. So it's not that difficult, but if you get a soil report with all this information, kind of walking through how the pieces fit together as a whole, the biological, the chemical, and the physical, which again is a function ideology and not just a concentration one, and which is why we have a chemical, physical, and biological focus now for soil health initiatives, is that you have to understand how those things work together. And then also how it applies to your system and your goals, if it's profit, or per acre profit or like a yield-based profit.
So you just bring up so many good points, and I have to decide which rabbit hole I want to go down, because I think that, one is kind of an anecdotal example. I have a good customer, and I always say I don't have customers, I have friends, because I just get on such a personal level with so many of them. And this one gentleman, he like grew this beautiful stand of our spring summer cover crop, and he had a great sorghum in Sudan. He's like, I don't even want to drill through this. And our whole system is really to focus on maximizing the carbon and nitrogen ratios from one planting to the next, if you're focusing on our particular system. So I'm like, I know it feels bad, but that's going to act as good cover. And then those beans and peas are going to break down quickly, while the sorghum in Sudan is going to last longer. And he's like, what am I going to, he was very concerned. He's like, what am I going to do next spring summer? He's like, this sorghum in Sudan is going to be. I go, no, we're jump starting biology here, because we're balancing these things. I'm like, and even my friend who helps manage my property, he's like, this is in the next year. He comes back and we're planting the spring summer mix into it again. He's like, where'd all that sorghum Sudan go? Like it's been consumed into what was a turnip and a radish and a rye grain. I go, it took all winter. It took time for it to break down. But in the short term, the beans and the peas and those lower carbon and things broke down. And I think to your point earlier, it's really something that it sounds easy to explain, but when you see it, it really helps you to go, like when you observe it in the field, it really helps you to go, oh, that's what a carbon to nitrogen ratio is. Like it just will click in somebody's mind. And that's been a really cool experience because people will come to me and go, I thought I was going to have to plow it under, or, and I'm like, no, it will cycle itself because it's not too heavy right now. So let me ask you this, because I feel like even in my experiences, which are far more limited to yours, I've seen where people will give up on a no-till or a cover crop because of this misunderstanding of residue management. I mean, there's like a whole science of just understanding residue management, whether it's like you said, spraying biologicals or some type of nitrogen. So do you see that often where people have this massive frustration? They put down 300 pounds of rye grain to the acre and then they try to go grow soybeans thinking, well, it's a legume. And it's like, yes, but you had so much carbon tie up and nitrogen tie up because of this high carbon nitrogen cover crop that even soybeans are going to struggle based on that. Hey, have you witnessed that? And do you think that a key to that is just more education, or how do we overcome that bridge?
Yeah, I think, well, especially for soils, and this is the same for, even soil science students getting into the work, is that everything's abstract. You're talking about, like when we talk about, I guess one example is like pedology or soil formation. You're reading about how these different horizons or profiles in a soil develop. It's really best to just get out in the field if you can see it for yourself, because then that gives you the context of what you're actually kind of working with. Same with like residue management. So an example is like about 2 years ago, I went out to Dr. Ward's property. We were getting some soil, and he was showing me some of the areas where he has a no-till system, and he moved the residue and dug into the soil, and you could see that it hadn't rained for a while. There's still moisture in there. So kind of understanding that role of residue visually, there's water here still, and this is why things are still growing. And the same is true for like if you see residues that do or don't break down. It's like you go out there like, oh, okay, there's like way too much grass out here. So seeing this in a field is the best way to make those connections, because everything is just going to be an abstract activity. You're like, and I get this question all the time. It's like, if you give someone advice, they say, well, what does it actually mean in terms of, okay, I'm out in the field. What am I actually doing? So if I'm trying to translate something, it's always in that regard is, what are your hands going to be doing once you get this information? Because that will give you the context, at least in your head, in terms of what you should be expecting. And it gives you less fear in terms of how to manage these things, because it's a lot. I mean, in some cases, it's a lot to kind of, juggle around your head, especially if you're looking at cover crop mixes, what you're going to be planting into, when to terminate, plant into that, is it going to be too much carbon in this mix? Is it too much nitrogen? Is it just going to burn off, in no time? So just getting out there and seeing is the best experience, and which is probably, I think, why they also say it takes a few growing seasons if you're switching from conventional to no-till to kind of see some of these things and get more comfortable with it. And don't do it all at once. Do it piecemeal it in. Don't convert everything at once, because you might set yourself up for disaster if you don't really understand what you're doing. So just being fearless in terms of getting out there, seeing what you're actually seeing. It's basically like your own lab for the most part. So that's how I started really enjoying soils, was getting into a lab or getting into a field, and I could see things like, oh, I did this chemical extraction. Now I see what cation exchange capacity is. I'm looking at the data. I did this in the lab. So then you get more comfortable with it. I'm not saying, be a chemist, but I'm saying get your hands dirty. It is soil, for crying out loud. So just get out in the field and take a look.
I always like to say my favorite tool, other than all, I have a penetrometer and I send tissue testing to you guys every year, on cover crops. And I love all of that. I literally am excited. I drive Melissa nuts. I'm always emailing her saying, hey, is it ready yet? And I apologize. I can't help myself, but just a shovel, I just a shovel. And I have another anecdotal example. So, dad's in his early 70s. He's got a big garden. Mom and dad live next door to me, and I have my garden. I have our well, right now I just put our fall, but I have walking cover crops growing in between my rows of tomatoes all year. And then I just mow them off with a push mower, and I'll just kind of Johnny Appleseed a little bit of more seed in between. And then when it gets too tall, for me or my son to go pick tomatoes, I'll mow it off again. And it just keep adding this diversity and new root systems. And I'll have soybeans in there in between my row. And he's like, what are you doing? Because he just wants me to till it up and go. And we planted similar varieties that we grew from seed. And it's just so funny because he goes, why are your tomatoes so much larger than mine? And relative, all the other management has been the same, other than he's in this no-till, he's more weed competition because I've used some weed matting to keep things low. And he's like, your plants just look fantastic, and arguably I've been doing it a little bit longer than he has. We started his a little bit later. But it's just interesting to see. And I would say that one thing I would like your opinion on, and I tell people similar to what you said, but I really would like your input, is I tell people tillage works. I think that's a thing that people get like really stuck on, is like, well, I've always tilled, or I'm like, tillage works. It's just more a question of like long-term sustainability of the system. I go, just if you look at it from whether you want to talk about chemistry, or you're pumping a lot of air into something that's, although you don't visually see, it's burning, right? It's consumption, and you're putting seed right in behind it. Like, tillage works. I think the question becomes of, for how long can that particular system, without relying on more and more inputs, like it's all comes into like 1 + 1, right? Like, does it equal 2, or do we have to add more in order to still get there? Do you agree with that? I mean, I know that's overly simple, but with that kind of understanding of like, yes, we know tillage works, but no-till can as well, but we have some things we have to get used to doing.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I mean, it's really interesting too to think about, because it might be one of these context things. So, for example, in Washington State, they do a lot of no-till research, but they have found that in these no-till systems, you get this banding of acidity, because you're not tilling the soil at all. So, in some of those cases, if it persists, tillage might work in terms of mixing the soil, adding some lime to break up that acidic layer, because with that acidity, it starts dissolving clay, and whenever you dissolve clay, aluminum is part of the structure. You'll get aluminum toxicity. It'll come out and it attacks roots. That's one of the big issues. So in some of those cases, every so often, it might work to till up the soil if you get that banding issue, if you can't get lime to that layer. So I think in that case, it does work. But then also going to your other point, you're talking about yours and your dad's, tomato differences. In those cases, because you don't till, and so you have the persistent roots in the ground, whether they be dead or alive, and so they're mostly alive, I would say, because you're always growing something, whether it's something in the inner layer or the crop itself. But that whole network below ground, if you're really more focused on the quality of your product, you really need that whole network, because it's roots talking to microbes, microbes talking back to roots. All these biosignals are going back and forth, and those are the sort of the chemicals that really sort of go into quality production. So like high antioxidant composition, it's everything that the plant needs that's going on that you can't really supply out of a bag. I mean, maybe if you use biostimulants in some cases, which a lot of that's kind of debatable, but they do have some of these things in there. It's just we're just not really understanding how it works, or in what systems they do and don't work for the most part. So if you're more focused on quality, like better tasting, larger tomatoes, that's when you get into things like, well, I shouldn't till the soil because I'm going to tear down that structure that's really kind of doing a lot of that work that I need to get that quality. So in each system, you have different approaches where you may need to till sometimes, especially like if you have a really persistent hard pan. Sometimes crops, no matter if it's a mustard, which has really deep, penetrating roots, cannot get through that hard pan. In some cases, it can. I've seen in many cases it has. But if you have a very persistent, maybe in some cases like a naturally occurring hard pan that you need to tear up, like some deep tillage, some cases you have to do that. So it really just depends when you need to do it. But yeah, it's not a long-term thing, I would say, because then you get into things like erosion. Really you're breaking down organic matter. All that carbon, like you said, you're adding a lot of air, you're oxidizing things quite rapidly. So you're going to be tearing down your long-term, stable carbon in the soil, which is that quality organic matter. So it's not sustainable, not for quality production, not for long-term conservation. So yeah, everything's the poisons in the dose is basically like what Paracelsus used to say. So if you keep doing it, you're going to poison the system long term. If you do it every once in a while, it's not going to cause a big problem.
Yeah, I think the Rodale Institute has some interesting stuff about how they've done rotational tillage for weed management. So if anybody's not familiar, they're an organic institute. It's been around since like the 30s or 40s, something like that. And one of the things that and they're in the Eastern US, which again, some of the research is going to be different than stuff from the Western US, excuse me, based on soil type and rainfall and things of that nature. But I know they've used tillage that way. And I'd like to pick your brain a little bit. And this is kind of a hot topic, and I don't know if I put it on the agenda. So if you're not comfortable talking about it, it's fine. But I'll share what I do. And so I've used roller crimpers. I've used mowing, but I find that it's a lot of times a balance of scale, and I've certainly used herbicides to manage tillage. Now, on our farm that we manage for wildlife and for timber, it's about 400 acres, and we are managing, well, 300 acres and then a little bit extra that is kind of newer to our management, but I'll just say 300 acres. And from a soil perspective, we try to reduce our herbicide. So if we're using herbicide, we're really sticking to glyphosate, glufosinate, things that are more on the plant themselves. But we're in southeastern Ohio, so it's foothills of Appalachia, and I always try to explain to people, yes, if I come out of winter and I have a very clean cover crop and I can go in there and do a roller crimper and run the drill right through. I normally will drill first, then run the roller crimper. That seems to be more efficient for me. You don't get your double disc jamming up and stuff from dead rye or whatever. So if you drill first, it's like running a comb through hair. It tends to run really well. And then if you crimp after, it seems to do pretty well. But you're getting, in my experience, 60 to 70% on multi-species cover crop termination. You're not going to get, what you're going to get with an herbicide, right? But in the situations like this past fall, we looked at it and there were some really nasty invasives that had come through and things like that, where we did decide to use some herbicide. And people say, well, herbicide's bad or whatnot. I go, but I would much rather do that than use tillage, because the risk of erosion in that type of terrain where, riding the tractor isn't even that fun sometimes because you feel like it's going to roll, right? It's a very rugged terrain scenario. So the risk of erosion is very high. And so to me, if I have to pick my poison, if you will, if I can use an herbicide once every 12 to 14 months on a grander scale, or even if it's twice in a year only, versus if I was planting, say, monoculture soybeans and I was going in, planting spraying them, 3-4 days, I would be a little bit more concerned. But in my experience, I've pulled a lot of PLFA data from fields that have had treatments, and I don't see anything on that, what I consider a relatively low dose on an annual basis. And again, I'm not using things that have long residuals that are going to stick in the soil. I don't get too much heartburn over it. Of course, I want to reduce it from a cost perspective, but what's your thoughts from how that impacts microbes and how it can impact people's decisions? Because again, the last thing I'll say, and then I promise I'll shut up, but I feel like a lot of times people get stuck in this situation where they've been fed so much one way or another. I can't, and they just get to this point, they're like, forget it. I'll just stop doing anything. And I think that's the worst thing that we can do for getting people interested in growing and soil health and capturing photosynthetic energy and being excited. Like, I think people should just get out there. If you reduce it by half, that's great. If you can't, okay, well, so I'm very passionate about that part. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I think about this quite often, especially with the reports, that you see randomly coming out about, herbicides and pesticides and, how they interact with soil, the soil microbiome. But the research shows that for the most part, you might, if you apply quite a bit of this stuff, you will impact it, but it rebounds quite fast because, for one thing, like glyphosate, it's a phosphorus source, and it's also a carbon source. So they can break it down. Now you will get into side issues, with like zinc availability, because glyphosate will chelate or complex with zinc, and so you'll have lower zinc availability. So understanding those side reactions is a totally different thing. And one of those things that you do have to kind of like pay attention to. But I would say, like in your case, I would be more worried about erosion, topsoil loss versus applying a herbicide because I know it's not long lasting. It'll do the job when you need it to, as long as you're not over applying it like crazy. Then those are the cases where I do get worried about everything from like exposure to soil quality, because I think in the long run you could start to foster a certain type of soil microbiome that's like leaning more towards one kind of dominant species, maybe in some of those cases. It's not a naturally balanced system. In most systems, like regenerative systems, you want almost an equal footing of fungal to bacterial communities. So, because they're doing two different jobs. Fungal communities are breaking down the harder to break down carbon, which are going into, things that the bacteria can break down. So kind of understanding that if you get more of one than the other, it's going to be not the best quality soil. Same if you over apply things, you're really kind of shifting the dynamic in that soil. But if you're doing it as a one-off every so often and not going crazy with it, the same with the tillage. If you're in an area where you're not prone to soil loss or topsoil loss or erosion whenever you till, then it's not going to be a terrible thing if you do it on a need basis. But if you're doing it one-off, like you said, every 14, 15 months in given areas and only given amounts, I'm not worried about it. Some people are, especially people that are strictly, organic. The big push now, like you mentioned, Rodale, they have their regenerative organic certification. Regenerative, you can use herbicides and pesticides and fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers. It's more of like the practice you're doing on the ground. Organic it's like kind of the opposite. You can till, but you can't use synthetics or herbicides, pesticides. So it's kind of like the marrying of these two things. So if you're kind of shooting for that, that both of those systems, you have to be very strict about what you're doing. Of course, you have to have a certain mindset and goal involved if you undertake those things. But I would say in most systems, again, the poison's in the dose. If you're going to be doing it every once in a while, it's not going to cause a lot of problems for the bacteria or the microbes in the soil, or you if you're afraid of consuming things that have herbicides in them.
Yeah, and I deal with it's funny because I'll deal with people on both ends of the spectrum. I'll deal with people who are like, listen, I want to do a burn down, and then I want the stuff to get out of the ground early, and then I'm going to hit it with a pre-emergent that's not going to hurt the crop that I'm growing, but I want to make sure nothing else, and then I'll have other people who are like, I don't want to do anything, and on those people, I tend to be like, okay, well, do you have, are you going to till? Well, I'd like to, well, can we till less? Like, and to me, even that's a win. Like, just even if we say, okay, can you do like I tell people, Google, conservation tillage, and look back behind the tractor and see is 70% of the soil covered with, your green, whatever you're tilling in, right? Like that to me is a win. But I also find, and I say this a lot, I people probably get tired of me saying it, but I'm like, we have to be realistic. Like if you don't have cattle, you're trying to grow a food plot or garden, you're not going to roller crimp your way out of a fescue pasture. Like if you can get cattle in there to graze it, but like I find that these people will call me and they're just like pulling their hair out, and they're so frustrated. I'm like, well, and they're like, well, I've been trying to I'm like, you're not going to mow your way out of a fescue pasture. It's literally meant to be mowed. Like, so like to me, it's like just go in there and use herbicide or till, right? And fit it, or the opposite. I'll have these guys be like, "Oh man, these fields they're rutted up," or I go in there and till it and get it right. Now, I think this goes back to, and I'd like to see your take on this, but understanding what that soil test says, because I tell people all the time, listen, if you're going to till and you want to get and your soil's super low in phosphorus, that would probably be a good time, especially if you're then going to go back into a no-till system, to get that, especially if you're going to put synthetic phosphorus, to get that into that root zone. Do you agree? Like if you're going to go in and till, like you better make sure you get the lime, get the gypsum down, because if not, like for me in no-till systems, and I've had success, but we get pretty good amount of rainfall in southeastern Ohio. We just let lime and gypsum and those things just naturally kind of weather through the soil through our rainfall, and we hope that the porosity, because of the diversity and stuff, is helping, right? To kind of move those things over time, and it's been successful. But if I had to go till a field, you better bet that I'm going to be trying to get everything down that first go, because I know after I transition to that no-till, I'm not going to be using tillage for a good long while, if ever again, on that particular space. Does that make sense as a prescription?
Yeah, I think especially so working with like hunters, deer hunters, and food plots, I noticed that they acquire this land. They're not agronomists. They want to do as minimal work as possible, which they end up being some of the best soil health growers because they want the system to do the work. So they have to really kind of get everything up and running. But when they acquire the property that they don't know a lot of the history, or it's really poor, worn out soil, maybe they have a hard, like a pre-existing hard pan from historic tillage or something, or it's just kind of like a really low fertility soil, just been beaten to death and back. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to do it, if you're going to dedicate your time and energy to a no-till system, and you're going to initially till, you make sure everything gets in there at the root zone. You want to get all the ingredients in there, to start, so that you don't have to come back the next year. And, if you don't see a response, what do I have to do to till again? Or was the tilling bad? You're raising more questions and, answers. But if you're going to start out, know what you need to put into the system. So get that soil test. Is the pH off? What do I need to put in there to correct that if I'm going to initially till it? Is the phosphorus low? What am I growing? Is the salt content too high in the soil? Is it going to kill germination, which is a huge issue that I see? A lot of these individuals will acquire land and they don't realize that salt could be an issue, and so they'll plant thinking, "Oh yeah, I planted, I applied fertilizer, and things started to grow, but then they all died off." And I'm like, "It sounds like a salt issue to me, or maybe it's a pH issue." But they don't know to test these things initially. They just throw things down. Actually, I talked to one guy. He said, "Oh yeah, I just had an old bag of lime in my garage, and I just went out there and just dumped lime everywhere." I was like, "Well, you're already starting at like a pH 7.5. Why did you put lime down?" So like understanding where you're starting and how to go forward from there. But yeah, I mean, I would say you're right. You have to kind of see what the foundation where you're starting and kind of build on it if you're going to dedicate and adopt a no-till system in the long run.
Yeah, and you actually taught me that. I remember one gentleman in Missouri had a really high sodium base saturation. Again, why ward is so critical, because we get the base saturations. And this gentleman had two farms in Missouri. In the one, he was like, "I feel like I'm the best farmer in the world. Anything I plant, it just does." And the other one was like 2 miles down the road. I think it was a little bit closer to a river, higher clay content. The drainage. It was, I think, if I recall, it was kind of like a terrace down, and he was trying to plant this more bottom field. And I just was like at a loss, and I sent it to you and you were looking at it and you're like, "Well, his sodium, I forget what it was, but it was high. It was 7 or 8% on his saturation." And it was one of those where it's like, we don't normally do this, but we would recommend, like a ripper and flushing. I think we recommended gypsum to try to push some of those things out of there after a ripping application. And I've actually then seen in a couple of people that I've helped with lawns. They're like, "Hey, I have this beautiful lawn, but there's this one section that I can't get anything to grow." Of course, you go through, is it shaded? But I said, pull a soil test out of that particular sample. And I got it back. And I'm like, that sodium saturation in that particular area is so high. And they put down gypsum, and it was their lawn, so they could water it really in, without having to till that particular area. And then they planted it and they had success. So like that $26 soil test saved them what was driving them crazy for years. So I think that's something that's really important. And I want to be cognizant of your time. So I'd like to try to wrap this up in like 15 minutes, if that's okay with you.
Oh, you're good. Yeah, you're good.
Okay. One of the things that we've done at Vitalize Seed, and I'd love to get your take on this, is I don't want to say I've gone full circle, because I certainly am not conventional, but I do scratch my head on some things that come out, because it's like there's this never-ending bank of fertility in a soil. And I used a deer hunting, but even a garden, I think, could be said for this. Let's just say that you could maximize on an 800 square foot garden, your tomato yield without any inputs, just cover crops, cover crops, cover crops. I think we have to ask the question eventually, where do you hit diminishing returns on the tomato yield? Or in the case of food plots, I would say at least east of the Mississippi River that I deal with. There are some further west, but east of the Mississippi River, relative to the habitat, so you don't have as big of ag. You're more limited, right? as far as for deer to browse on and things like that. 90% of people, if they put up like a little 3 foot diameter chicken wire cage or 14 gauge wire cage and to measure browse, they will tell me whether they plant 1 acre or they plant 20 acres of these food plots. They'll say there was 2 foot missing or 3 foot missing. And deer are concentrate selectors. They kind of eat and then they move. They're not standing in an area where like rotational grazing, where we're moving nutrients through the rumen of a cow and then depositing them here from plot A to plot B and then back again, where you're kind of naturally moving this intake in phosphorus and it's broken down. And then it's getting deposited over here because you're moving the cows back and forth. You don't really get that with deer. You might see a couple piles of scat here and there, but it's very random, So really what you're getting is a ton of biomass removed year after year after year after year. And I just question of, okay, how long can we do that before the bank eventually runs out, right? Like we can use species like sorghum and Sudan, which unless the density is super high, deer typically don't consume. They'd have to be really, really hungry. I just think there's a natural reason that they don't select those. But even then, it seems like eventually we need to apply something, be it a foliar to just at least kind of force feed that plant, or spoon feed, I think is the term you used earlier. I tend to apply more. I don't have a manure spreader. We came out with a product that's derived from manure, but it's more in a pelletized form that you can broadcast. So it's going to be that slow release. It's all natural type products. In gardens, people use things like blood meal or bone meal kind of naturally to move through these no-till systems. But it seems like to me, eventually, you may have to do something to help the system along. Is that legitimate, or do you think we're talking lifetimes in some of these soils before the bank would truly ring?
Yeah, I would say so. That's a really good point. Actually, I talk about this with Dr. Ward pretty often because he always talks about replenishing the system. You're tapping everything out because you're removing nutrients. So how are you putting them back into the soil? Whether it's crop production or like a food plot. So you can't, like you said, you can't bank on the fact that deer are gonna stay right there and just be like these eating machines, eating and pooping machines. Because their habits are totally different than like managing like a grazing system. So I think just being cognizant of the different pools you're working with. So there's the bank, then there's what they say that the cash in the pocket. You have like a bunch of cash coming out, and that's the currency flow. But it's tapping into the bank, so you have to kind of see what's in the bank. So you can do like a total nutrient digest to see what all's there, and keeping an eye on that to make sure that you're not essentially mining the soil. And I think in the other point you made, planting species that aren't going to be consumed, or they might be more slow release with time, being more targeted with some of those applications or like those management strategies. So you have to kind of know more about maybe not plant physiology, but sort of like things that break down faster, things that are palatable, non-palatable, their nutrient content. Are they just really full of carbon? Are they being broken down and reincorporated into the soil? Do you need to add something to help break that down? Because along with these things, you have to look at nitrogen to different elemental ratios, phosphorus to nitrogen, carbon to nitrogen, because microbes need these different ratios to break things down and incorporate them into long-term structures in the soil. So kind of understanding some of those relationships as well. But you always have to be mindful of of the resources you have, because they're not infinite. If you are growing things, they're being pulled out of the soil, and what you do with what's coming out of the soil is going to depend on what is going to go back into the soil. So you might have to manually come back in and spray something, maybe if your phosphorus is being tapped out, kind of replenishing that system. A lot of it also depends on your soil type. So if you have like a high iron soil, a lot of those things will be stuck in the soil because iron grabs onto a lot of things, so like phosphorus. So they'll be more embedded into the soil. Or if you have a more mica-rich soil, you might have a lot of potassium just naturally, although a lot of it might not be available. It just depends on what you're growing. So yeah, you have to be mindful of your supply that you have on site and how you're working with it in terms of its long-term, its shelf life, I would say.
So how do you feel that natural amendment, like, so all of our products, right, wrong, or indifferent, we focus on natural amendments. So like I said, we call it no-till nurture because, like, for lawns, right, it's a fescue lawn, let's say. Well, I can't really get phosphorus down in any other way than applying it for, and I don't have a manure spreader, and most people aren't. So this actually has like no smell to it at all. So it's really neat, and it's spreadable. It's a little bit dusty, but it's spreadable, and we add things like humics and stuff like that to try to jumpstart the biology and say a fescue monoculture. So hopefully through, worms and microbes and all these things, natural porosity that occurs, that phosphorus actually gets down in the fescue lawn without having, and allows the fescue to get access to that through kind of microbial communications versus if I just threw, 0 20 20 down on a high CEC, I'm probably going to be waiting a while for that phosphorus to get down there. So, but the other thing that I find interesting, and this is really a rabbit hole, I probably should start the conversation with this, but we can always have another one, is this idea in the nuances that go into, like, okay, if you apply a fish emulsion or you apply an amino acid nitrogen product foliarly, or you apply a manure, like whether it's our product or you're literally applying manure, how the microbial systems react differently to that, say, and how you're creating a plant that's ultimately the goal is like, we want this plant to be as efficient as possible from photosynthetic energy capture and root exudation versus how when you apply these in synthetic forms, a lot of the science shows, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, that your root exudation can actually slow or even stop because it's almost like an IV of nutrients versus this kind of natural process that's saying, hey, thank you. I want more of this. Let's communicate with the biology, for lack of a better way to explain that. What are your kind of thoughts on that and the science behind that?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, especially when I talk to like biostimulant groups, because they're banking on a lot of these kind of like biochemical interactions that they're sort of, taking advantage of that naturally happen. They're just kind of like promoting it a bit more. Um, but given to their own devices, in a system that's not tilled, like say a native system, the plants are communicating and doing everything with it needs to with the microbes. And because of that, because, like if you're, like you said, kind of like giving them an IV injection, they don't have to do a lot of the work themselves. So, another case is that they're not producing antioxidants in response to environmental stressors. But those antioxidants, those polyphenolic compounds that we benefit from like superfoods like blueberries and things like that, they'll be lower in those chemicals because the plant didn't need to produce anything. It had no stress for the most part. We were just like giving it everything it needed. So, in a lot of these more like natural systems where you're using non-synthetics like organic amendments, compost manures, like fish meals, all these different things like biostimulants, humic, fulvic acids, I think it's a better approach because it's more of a quality game at that end. So you're not just injecting in something into the ground. You're kind of giving the plant the tools it needs, and you have to know when to apply these things as well. Especially if you talk about humic and fulvic acids, the research shows that they're great for germination, especially in stressed environments. So if you put it in with the seed, you'll get a pretty good response every time for the most part. Now, if you're in a high fertility system, it might be more questionable. But I'd say in those systems, you might not need some of these things, So kind of knowing, when to apply them and how they work for the most part. But yeah, I would say if it was me, I would lean more towards adding things that are more natural into a system just because I know I don't want to put something that is non-natural that might kind of throw off a balance of some kind, like a benefit in the end, just because I understand that the plant is going to produce beneficial things in response to stress, environmental stress. Stress isn't always bad. We grow from stress in many cases. Plants do too. So I think if you're just giving it things that it needs for the most part without oversupplying some of those things, for me, that's the better approach. And I know it might be harder in many cases, but you do need to understand how these items work and the breakdown rates, the chemical composition, and again, when to apply them. So I think I lean more towards that.
So it's interesting because we have that product I was mentioning, and we have a foliar stack, which is a fish emulsion, kind of a biostimulant, which is just natural sugars and humics, fulvics, things like that, seaweed extracts. It's kind of that blanket. I spray it on my tomatoes if I start to see some stress of like even like a fungal thing or something like that, I'll put that fish emulsion and also we have a little orchard too, and I'll spray it on those trees. And it's been amazing to see the response without having to use a fungicide by using things where you like will spray it on there, and I'm assuming there's a biological reaction there that all of a sudden you come back a week later and like all those leaves are looking back to normal. You might see still a little bit of fungus, on the leaf or something, but not even having to apply like a copper fungicide, which I'm not against. I mean, I would do so if I felt like I needed to, but just by kind of like spoon feeding it to see. And then we have an amino acid nitrogen product, which is of course good to get plants started and things like that. But what I find most interesting is I'll say to people, like if they have good fertility, I'm looking at their soil tests, I'm like, how are things growing? But they're like, I want to get a little boost. And I'll say, well, you can use our no-till nurture is what we call it. It's a granular product. And they're like, what, 300 pounds to the acre? And I'm like, no, you already have a lot of things in your bank. And I'm like, these are organic in nature. So it's going to be slow release. And I'm like, we're looking to feed the system, not just say 300 pounds to the acre of triple 19, because that's what it says on the back of the bag. And we know that 90% of that's not going to be available. So we have this outrageous amount. And I think that's where I've been really trying to help educate people, is to understand in kind of these food plot scenarios or lawn care scenarios, or even on some of these smaller, flower farms and things that we've worked with, is there's been such this ingrained in us because we don't understand maybe the chemistry totally. And I'm not saying I do, I rely on people like yourself, but we've been ingrained in this just like, 200 to 300 pounds to the acre blind, right? Like we're just going to put this down without understanding of like, well, the reason we're doing that is like 90% of that surface applied phosphorus is not going to go anywhere. And maybe 70% of that surface applied nitrogen, if we don't get rainfall, is going to go back up in the air, and we don't understand that. So we just kind of apply it, right? Mm-hmm. And the K is going to depend on soil type where it goes. But I think that's something for me that's been really fun, because people will go, I put this down. I had like right before we started, he goes, I put 40 pounds down on this acre of your no-till nurture. And we have it's called seed armor. It's a rhizobium for legumes. And then we actually add humics to it, and it's dusty. People get upset because it is real fine. But he sent me an image. He's like, I've never had growth like this in 10 days, and it's in a no-till broadcast system. And he's like, no, he got good rainfall. I mean, there's no magic bullet, but it's been interesting to see because he previously had been more like 300 pounds of triple 13, or so. He was like 40 pounds to the acre. Like, you're going to see a better response. Two more questions I have for you, and then I promise I will stop. And I'm also going to have to stop because I'm going to have to take care of the kiddos. But how do you feel? Again, can we hit this level of diminishing returns as we're getting biology and fungi working? And one thing I always do, just as a side note, and again, another discussion, is if and when I use tillage or herbicide, I always use a mycorrhizal fungi inoculant on the seed. I just feel like if I'm going to go over that field with a drill, I can expedite the rate at which that fungal associations are going to happen if I put it right on the seed versus waiting. Not saying they won't happen naturally, but if I can speed that up at all, I think it's beneficial. So I've always been a big proponent of, and all the science I've seen, specifically in row crop or pumpkin growing or something like that, has pointed that direction. With that being said, as we build up, so one, do you agree with that? Number two, as we build up this biological, both living and then necromass and dead microbes, how much of a role do you feel that plays into soil fertility or plant available nutrients? And does it hit a point where you're like you're saturated?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Well, first, I think the inoculation is really good. I mean, a lot of the research shows that it's beneficial. You're just kind of promoting what's naturally going to happen and a bit faster. And I think you also have to understand in some, maybe in some cases, for some GM species, some of those associations might have been bred out. So is it going to work in that system? So kind of understanding how those, things kind of tie together, because I've seen some of the research on that too. It's kind of interesting. I never even thought about that. I just thought those associations were always going to be there. But in some cases, because, we've worked so much with modifying some of these organisms, some of those associations don't really make any sense, or they're just not in there anymore. So I think the inoculation works really well. So in terms of, I would say the system and the diminishing returns and the saturation of the system, I would say you probably could get to a point where you're just not going to get any more out of what you're putting in, because really it's kind of it really is, I would say it's not so much a yield game. It is really kind of like a quality and a systems game. So, and with that, you kind of have to pull back a little bit because you have to realize, if your goal is profit, your inputs are going to be going way down. And actually, Jonathan Lundgren did a study. I forgot the other researcher who did the study, but they did a regenerative ag study, and they found that the yield went down in many of these cases, but the per acre profit increased like 79%, because their inputs for herbicides, fertilizers, it all went down. And so it's like, well, something else has to click in your head. It's like, well, okay, well, maybe yield isn't the goal. It's great, but if it's a profit game, you need to change your mindset. So with that, you will hit a point where your inputs, aren't going to equate to your outputs, because it's an engine. You're basically making sure the engine's running, the engine being the microbes kind of breaking everything down. And it kind of essentially turns into, I always use the term like a chipper shredder. So you're throwing stuff in there, cover crops or whatnot, or organic amendments, and they're being broken down and assimilated into these really long-term structures. And that's what the plants really benefit from. So your third question, that the microbial necromass, that is really kind of where the nutrient dense organic matter is, and also long-term carbon. So if you get into carbon sequestration kind of aspects of it, that's where the money is. But that's also where all the goods are for the plant. It's where all the, marriage of, biochemicals from the microbes breaking down of the necromass, proteins are in there, signalers, humic and fulvic acids are in there. So it's this hodgepodge of all the good stuff. And it's there for quite a while. It is pretty long term because it's protected by mineral soil because it's very small but very dense. It plays a huge role in quality and long-term production. So I would say you will hit a point. There's been a lot of research looking at saturation, specifically of carbon in those systems. How much carbon can you stuff in there? But along with the carbon, there's also nitrogen and phosphorus and all the other things the plants need. How much can you stuff in there? It's a function of the texture of the soil, and that's also a question too. Is like, can you modify that? Can you add more of something to increase that? In some cases, it's shown that you can. Is it worth it? I don't know. But even the question of saturation is still being researched. Well, it's like, well, the research shows that it might not have a limit. You might be able to get more out of it if you put more into it. That's a big question mark. So it really just depends on how much work you want to put into this. And is it going to be like a yield goal, or is it like a profit goal, or if it's a conservation goal, things like that. What are your different values that are kind of guiding your choices here?
Well, okay. Amazing. And last question I have for you, and this is perfect into it. And I recall actually, I read the literature. I believe you had shared it somewhere, and I saw that about the carbon saturation, and it was fascinating. Maybe I can link that in for anybody that's interested, because it's just, I always tell people, I go, if you want to realize how little you know, look at some of the brilliant people like Patrick who are doing the research, because it's like mind blowing. I'm like, it's like, I think I have a little bit of an idea of something, and then I'm like reading this research. I'm like, these people are so brilliant that it's mind blowing. So with all of that, where do you think these brilliant people, where is the science of soil fertility and biology going in the next 5 to 10 years? I mean, where do you think it's going to take us?
Well, it's getting more and more detailed, which is kind of scary in the same regards, because I feel like we went really fast from being, where the chemists were like the big players, they were doing all the fertilizer development and the field trials, and then we went into the soil health realm, and then it's all microbiology. Well, now we're getting into like really what's going on, and that's all biochemistry. So it feels like in a very short period of time, we went from, being able to get all your information on one instrument in a lab to needing like, a DNA extraction system analyzer, liquid chromatography system, because I get these questions all the time. It's like, well, we don't have some of those instruments. So I think where it's going is we're really enriching our understanding of what's going on below ground. And not just for our own benefit, but things like food quality. And I think because there's only been one preliminary study out that looked at regenerative systems and food quality, and so hopefully more of that will start coming out. So I think that's going to be the big thing, with, like I mentioned, Rodale's certification, you know, because that's going to be a market value. That's going to help promote, a lot of this activity. Is like, well, if I can get a higher premium, if I'm actually going to be doing these things and conserving resources, better environmental quality, better products, people will pay for that. Well, that's my incentive. So trying to understand what people are actually getting into and what their, what the benefit actually is. And I think that's where it's going really fast. Especially with the biostimulant research. You apply things, it works in this instance, it doesn't work in this instance. Why? It's like, well, it's way more complicated than we thought. It's these signalers doing this to this, which is causing this reaction. So I think that's where it's going. Is we're getting a better understanding in a very short amount of time in terms of the below ground back and forth, and what that means in terms of agronomy. Our practices going forward, our markets in some of these cases. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm a little worried because I'm not the best biochemist, but I do like reading about this research. And I think people in this field are having their heyday. I think chemists, we had our heyday way back, and now it's all microbiologists and biochemists. So it's their time to shine, I think.
It's very interesting, and I think that I'm looking forward to see where things go. And I've always said to people, like when I'm talking about our amendments or soil treatments or I go, listen, don't look at this as a silver bullet. Look at it as like an insurance policy, because some soils that are super low in fertility might see a really crazy good response, because they're just starting from a really poor baseline. And maybe somebody who's using it in, I'm going to use Iowa, I'm going to pick on Iowa again, but really dark, rich Iowa soils, they're like, I used it in, yeah, I think it helped, but I didn't see this crazy gain, right? And that's why it's like an insurance policy. Maybe it's just going to give you, and it's in a lot of those, especially seed inoculants, it's relatively inexpensive. And I think to wrap up, I'll just say thank you so much for the time. I can't wait till we can do this again, because I could have talked to you for about 3 days. And I think the biggest takeaway is get out in the field, take a shovel, guys and gals, and look at the soil and see what it's telling you. Look at the plants. And if you haven't done it, do a soil test. And if you're really interested, I would say do a cover crop tissue test and send it over to board, because that has taught me a ton, along with I've done Total Nutrient Digest, PLFA, and all the other great stuff that you all offer. So thank you for being a resource to myself and to Vitalize. And thank you so much for your time.
Well, yeah, thanks, Albert. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great. And I'm the same. I could talk 3 days about this stuff, and we can do it again. Hopefully people find the information useful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.